It began not with a scream or a splatter, but with a fever. In a mansion tucked into the leafy streets of Oyster Bay, New York, the year 1906 brought a strange kind of dread, not the chaos of an intruder or the frenzy of fire, but a sickness that bloomed slowly, invisibly, through linen and cutlery. One by one, the affluent Warren household fell ill, first the laundress, then the youngest daughter, then the matriarch herself. Doctors arrived in pressed coats and stiff collars, puzzled. No one had died yet, but the symptoms had that unmistakable bite: high fever, rose-colored rashes, vomiting and confusion. The diagnosis, typhoid, was shocking. This was a disease of slums and sweatshops, not the drawing rooms of the upper crust, and yet someone had brought it here. Someone had carried it in their blood like a secret. She had come just weeks earlier, hired through a referral, a quiet, capable woman who made excellent peach ice cream and never spoke much. Her name was Mary Mallon, and she had already moved on. By the time they connected her to the outbreak, she was long gone, off to another family, another kitchen, another unsuspecting host. Mary Mallon did not look like a villain. She did not lurk in shadows or speak in riddles. She was stocky, stern, and unflinching, with the permanent scowl of someone who had spent too long scrubbing other people's messes. Born in 1869 in Cookstown, Ireland, she arrived in New York as a teenager, alone, poor, and determined. Domestic work was one of the few options available to an Irish immigrant woman, and Mary was good at it, very good. She was hired again and again by wealthy families as a cook, a coveted role among staff, and one she held with pride. Her meals were considered refined and nourishing, and her employers always praised her work. But beginning in 1900, a dark pattern emerged. Wherever Mary cooked, people became ill. At first it seemed like coincidence, a bout of bad shellfish perhaps, but then it happened again and again. Each time the symptoms were the same. Each time the families were affluent, isolated, and stunned. Each time Mary left before the illness had fully bloomed. She would pack her belongings, keep her head down, and move on. No one suspected the cook. No one ever suspects the cook. By the time she was traced to her 7th outbreak, the trail of infection stretched across Manhattan and into Long Island. Yet Mary herself had never shown a single symptom. She was a ghost carrier, a biological time bomb, and she had no idea, or at least, that's what she would say later. The man who finally connected the thread was George Soper, a sanitation engineer, not a doctor, but a disease detective in the rising world of public health. In 1906, he was hired to investigate the mysterious typhoid outbreak in the Warren household. The family's lifestyle was clean, their water filtered, their staff vetted. It made no sense until Soper started pulling at a name that kept appearing in other outbreaks: Mary Mallon. She had worked for the Warrens, and 6 of their 11 family members had fallen ill. Soper cross-referenced other wealthy families and found a grim pattern. Mary had cooked for 7 households since 1900, and at least 22 people had contracted typhoid after her arrival. Several had died. Still, it was unthinkable. Mary looked healthy. She had never been hospitalized. She didn't cough, didn't limp, didn't bleed. But Soper was convinced she had to be a healthy carrier, someone who harbored the bacteria in her body without becoming sick herself. A medical phenomenon not yet accepted or understood. When he finally confronted her in a kitchen and asked for samples of her urine and feces, Mary responded the way any proud, working-class woman in 1906 might, with fury. She hurled kitchen utensils at him and stormed off. She was no criminal, she said. She was a cook. But the bacteria didn't care about pride. It traveled in silence, blooming in intestines and dish rags and cream sauces, and Mary, furious and disbelieving, kept cooking. Soper wasn't finished. He tracked Mary relentlessly, warning health officials and publicizing his findings in professional circles. But Mary refused to cooperate. She didn't believe in germs. The germ theory of disease, still relatively new, was to her a kind of classist myth, a weapon wielded by elites against immigrants and the poor. In her eyes, she was being scapegoated for illnesses she never experienced herself. But the Board of Health had heard enough. In 1907, authorities forcibly removed Mary from a Park Avenue brownstone where she was employed. She fought like hell, scratching, biting, and swearing the entire way. They pinned her down and took her by ambulance to the Willard Parker Hospital, where they extracted stool samples by force. The results were conclusive. She was a carrier of Salmonella typhi. She was a walking epidemic, and so they sent her to North Brother Island, a small quarantine facility on the East River, usually reserved for tuberculosis patients. Mary was isolated in a small cottage and placed under permanent surveillance. She had committed no crime. She had never been charged or convicted, and yet she was imprisoned indefinitely. In the public mind, she had a new name now, Typhoid Mary. The newspapers loved the phrase. It sounded mythical, almost supernatural, like something contagious in the mind as well as the body. They drew cartoons of her in aprons, ladling skulls into soup bowls. The woman who once fed the rich was now a symbol of invisible horror, and she despised it. North Brother Island was a place where time died slowly. Set between the Bronx and Rikers Island, it was a forgotten sliver of land choked with overgrowth, decaying buildings, and silence. Typhoid patients came and went, but Mary stayed. She wandered the grounds alone, under constant watch. For nearly 3 years, her only human contact came from hospital staff and the rare visitor, though most feared her. The doctors debated what to do. Some wanted to remove her gallbladder, believing it was the seat of the infection. Others saw that as too risky. Mary refused surgery. She refused the idea that she was sick at all. Her isolation became a legal and ethical quagmire. Could the state confine a woman indefinitely, not for what she had done, but for what she might do? She had no due process, no trial, just a sentence that never officially began. In 1910, new leadership at the health department prompted a cautious release. The commissioner decided to let her go, but only if she signed a legally binding agreement. She would never work as a cook again, never handle food, never endanger others. Mary agreed. She left North Brother Island quietly, with almost no money, no friends, and nowhere to go. The city turned its back. The newspapers moved on, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the ghost might finally rest. But poverty is a loud persuader, and hunger has a way of making oaths feel distant. Mary tried. For a while, she worked as a laundress, scrubbing sheets and starching collars in the sweat-stained basements of tenements. But laundry paid half of what cooking did, and the work was brutal. She moved often, always under assumed names: Mary Brown, Marie Breshoff, Mrs. Herman. She was too well known now, and too reviled. Typhoid Mary was a household phrase, and even children spat it on the street like a curse. Her life had narrowed into corners, cheap rooms, short-term jobs, mistrustful glances, and then slowly she returned to the one skill she had mastered. By 1915, Mary was back in kitchens, private homes at first, then a bakery, then, fatally, a hospital. Under the alias Mrs. Brown, she took a job at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan, a place filled with new mothers and vulnerable infants. Within weeks, typhoid swept through the wards. 25 people were infected, 2 died. When the outbreak was investigated, the hospital cook fled. But this time they knew the signs, the pattern, the silence that came before the fever. George Soper returned to the story like a ghost himself, tracking Mary's fake identity until the truth peeled back. She was caught in a friend's apartment, cornered and exhausted. She didn't fight this time. There was no energy left. Her betrayal of the promise she signed 5 years earlier made her a public enemy all over again, and this time the authorities would not let her go. Mary Mallon was returned to North Brother Island in March 1915. She was 46 years old, and this time there would be no conditional release. Her second quarantine was a life sentence in everything but name. The authorities gave her a new cottage, a sparse one-room structure with barred windows and a porch that faced the water. The city had expanded its hospital staff since her last stay, and now Mary was surrounded by other inmates, tuberculosis patients mostly, though she kept her distance. The staff at first were wary. Some refused to even deliver her meals. She was watched like a caged animal, a curiosity of medicine and a cautionary tale rolled into one. Eventually, she was given small tasks in the hospital lab, where she washed beakers and cleaned slides. Ironic, perhaps, perhaps, for someone so feared for contamination. Over the years, she became a quiet fixture of the island, wandering its paths in solitude, looking out across the water toward a city that had forgotten her. New York had moved on to new horrors: war, depression, crime. But Mary remained, a relic of a past plague. Her name would live on, even as her body aged and broke down. To the health department, she was patient number 1, the first known asymptomatic carrier of typhoid in the US. But to the public, she was still Typhoid Mary, the killer cook, the woman who poisoned without knife or gun, who carried death in her gut and denial in her mouth, and she never stopped claiming she had done nothing wrong. In the years that followed, Mary Mallon became both myth and afterthought. Doctors still studied her case, students wrote theses on her pathology, and tabloids occasionally dredged up her name to stoke fear, always accompanied by the same grotesque caricature: a plump Irish woman in an apron serving skulls on a platter. But Mary herself faded into the background of medical history, alive yet forgotten, a ghost prisoner. She was never allowed to leave North Brother Island again. Letters she wrote to the Department of Health were ignored. No family ever came to visit. No lawyer ever took her case. She spent her birthdays alone, her holidays in silence, and as decades passed, the world changed around her. Germ theory became universally accepted. Vaccines advanced, but the fear of the carrier remained, a fear Mary had come to embody. In private, staff described her as proud and aloof, rarely smiling, unwilling to admit her role, even after years in isolation. She read newspapers, cooked her own meals in her small kitchen, and kept her cottage immaculately clean, as though trying to rewrite the narrative with every polished surface. Still, illness grew inside her, not the typhoid she denied, but the ordinary decay of age and loneliness. By the early 1930s, her hands shook, her legs weakened, and then, on Christmas Eve of 1932, Mary suffered a stroke that paralyzed the right side of her body. She would never walk again. The cook who had once fed the rich was now spoon-fed herself, confined to a hospital bed on an island no one remembered. After the stroke, Mary Mallon's world shrank to the confines of a single hospital room. The woman once accused of spreading death through the city now sat motionless beneath crisp white sheets, her voice dulled and her movements robbed by paralysis. Attendants came and went, some too young to remember her infamy, others instructed not to touch her for too long. She had become institutional wallpaper, visible but barely noticed. Her mind remained sharp, though. She could still speak, slowly, and her thick Irish brogue clung to every word like a second skin. Occasionally, a journalist would send a letter, fishing for another quote, another denial. She never gave them what they wanted. To the end, she insisted she had never caused harm. She resented the doctors, the scientists, the system. Her belief never changed, that she was a scapegoat, not a vector. Yet the evidence, by then, was overwhelming. In total, she had been linked to at least 53 infections and 3 confirmed deaths. But many believed the true number was far higher, hundreds, perhaps, victims scattered across kitchens, nurseries and mansions, unnamed and forgotten. Still, Mary clung to her version of the story, that she was simply a woman trying to survive in a world rigged against her, a woman punished for something she couldn't see, couldn't feel, and didn't understand. The line between criminal and victim, between contagion and personhood, blurred in her wake, and that ambiguity is what makes her story linger like a fever dream. Mary Mallon died on November 11, 1938. She was 69 years old and had spent the final 23 years of her life in forced quarantine on North Brother Island. There was no grand announcement, no public outcry, just a short notice in a few local papers. Mary Mallon, known as Typhoid Mary, dies in seclusion. An autopsy confirmed what had long been suspected. Her gallbladder was teeming with Salmonella typhi. The very organ she had refused to have removed decades earlier may have been the reservoir of death all along. But in death, as in life, Mary was more symbol than woman. The health department buried her in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, far from the city she once moved through unseen. No family claimed the body, no mourners came. Her grave bore no elaborate inscription, just a modest headstone, the final silence after years of noise. But her legacy didn't rest. In the decades that followed, Typhoid Mary became more than a name. She became a term for any public health threat, any carrier of invisible danger. Politicians used it, doctors invoked it. The fear of asymptomatic transmission would echo again in future pandemics. HIV, SARS, COVID. Mary's story was retold in textbooks and case studies, each version more clinical than the last. But the horror of it wasn't just microbial, it was existential. She was punished for being dangerous, not evil, feared for what lived inside her, not what she chose. In the end, her story isn't about sickness, it's about isolation, blame, and the terror of the unseen. Mary Mallon's legacy didn't die with her body. Instead, it metastasized into law, medicine, and folklore. Public health officials quietly used her case to justify future quarantines, shaping the boundaries between safety and civil liberty. Medical schools taught her story as both a warning and a curiosity. Epidemiologists named her the first healthy carrier in American history, a term that now seems clinical, almost antiseptic. But beneath that sterile phrasing lies something far more unsettling. The idea that one can be a threat without knowing it, that you can wake, work and walk among people while unknowingly bringing death with you. That fear never left the public psyche. During later health scares, from polio to AIDS to COVID-19, the ghost of Typhoid Mary was summoned again. Whenever someone asymptomatic was found to be dangerous, her name was whispered like a curse. Not a woman anymore, but a cautionary archetype. And yet, the real Mary, flesh and bone and rage and confusion, was more complex than the headlines ever allowed. She wasn't malicious, she was stubborn, uneducated, proud. A working-class immigrant who rejected the elite's explanations and refused to believe she could be sick without symptoms. That resistance cost her nearly half her life. But even now, her case raises questions that science alone cannot answer. Was her punishment necessary or monstrous? Was she a danger to others or a scapegoat crafted by a society desperate to believe disease had a face? In trying to contain a virus, they locked away a human being, and that act, though buried under decades of medical progress, still festers like a wound. There's a haunting stillness to North Brother Island now. Nature has reclaimed it. Ivy smothers the walls, roofs collapse under decades of rain and rot, and rusted beds lie beneath broken windows where patients once stared out over the East River. It is a graveyard without tombstones, a forgotten quarantine colony left to moulder in silence. And yet, if you walk its overgrown paths, if you stand before the collapsed ruins of the Riverside Hospital, you'll find remnants of Mary Mallon's captivity. Her cottage still stands, barely. The wood is warped, the door collapsed, the porch devoured by moss and vines. Some say you can feel a presence there, not malevolent, but watchful. It's not the ghost of a killer, but of a woman erased. Tourists don't come here. The island is off limits to the public, monitored by the Parks Department and home only to nesting birds and broken stone. But sometimes, urban explorers sneak in. They film videos in the decayed hospital wings, their voices hushed as they whisper her name, Typhoid Mary, as if saying it aloud might conjure something. The truth is, her story still echoes because it never truly ended. In every debate about mandatory vaccines, in every legal argument about quarantines and individual rights, her shadow looms. She is the original case study in the terror of invisible danger. The moment science, fear and policy collided to cage a woman for life. And now, the land she walked rots quietly beneath the weight of what was done to her. Long before Mary Mallon became Typhoid Mary, she was simply a girl fleeing famine. She had sailed to America in search of opportunity like thousands of Irish immigrants before her, carrying hope in her chest and nothing in her hands. She found work, not glory. Her world was one of soot-black kitchens, iron pots, and brutal hours, feeding the wealthy while living in their basements. It's easy to forget, when reading medical journals and court documents, that Mary was a product of the same systems that condemned her. She had no formal education, she couldn't read medical texts or understand the microscopic invaders hiding in her body. When Soper told her she was spreading death, she heard only condescension. Germs were an abstraction, hunger was real, and cooking had been her one skill, her path to survival. To take it from her was to unmake her identity. The state didn't offer compensation or retraining, just exile, isolation, shame, and so she resisted, not because she wanted to harm, but because she didn't want to vanish. In her mind, she was no criminal. She had never lifted a knife in violence, never plotted a murder. She baked, she boiled, she cleaned, and yet, her body became the vessel for something monstrous. That irony of a woman who nourished also infecting is what makes her story so tragic. She was punished not for evil intent, but for the hidden mechanisms of biology. In trying to live, she became infamous. In trying to serve, she became feared. And in the end, she remained misunderstood by nearly everyone who spoke her name. Even among medical professionals, Mary's case sparked division that has never fully settled. Some viewed her as a tragic necessity, a unique threat that had to be neutralized for the greater good. Others saw her treatment as a gross abuse of civil rights, a woman imprisoned without trial, her humanity stripped beneath layers of bureaucracy and fear. The truth lies somewhere between. Yes, she endangered others. Yes, her refusal to stop cooking led to real deaths. But she was also failed by a system that never educated her, never tried to understand her resistance, never offered her a path forward besides permanent exile. And worse, she became a caricature. Typhoid Mary, the Grim Reaper in an apron. Her story was sensationalized until all nuance bled out. She was painted as unfeeling, stupid, even malicious, an immigrant menace made monstrous by ignorance. That stereotype served a purpose. It allowed society to ignore the deeper horror, that anyone could carry death unknowingly. It was easier to invent a villain than accept the terrifying randomness of infection. Easier to say, she is different, than admit, this could be me. That fear never truly faded. Even today, her name is invoked as shorthand for selfishness, danger, recklessness. But the real Mary Mallon was none of those things, not entirely. She was prideful, yes, but also scared, cornered, confused. She lived in an era that gave her no language to understand what she carried inside, and so she clung to the only truth she could control, her innocence, even as the world wrote her into its nightmares. By the time Mary entered her final decade on North Brother Island, the world beyond had transformed. Automobiles clogged the streets of New York, radios buzzed with jazz and news of foreign wars, and medicine itself had taken great strides. Vaccines, antibiotics, and a growing understanding of epidemiology had begun to tame the wild panic that once surrounded diseases like typhoid. But Mary remained untouched by that progress. She lived as though in amber, trapped in the moral logic of 1907, forgotten by those who once feared her. Visitors no longer came. Even George Soper, who had made his name on her case, moved on to other studies. Only the doctors at Riverside still monitored her health, more out of obligation than concern. She would occasionally receive letters from curious students or journalists, but her replies were brief, clipped, resentful. The name Typhoid Mary still enraged her. "I was always healthy," she once insisted in a rare interview. "They made me a freak." In her eyes, the real sickness was not in her body, but in how she had been treated, ripped from society, labeled a danger, and denied a second chance. The island had become her coffin long before her body gave out, and as her strength faded, the staff prepared for what they knew was inevitable. There would be no family to claim her, no protest, no defense, just the quiet ending of a long and bitter exile. But the disease she carried, both the bacterial one and the moral questions her case raised, would outlive her by generations. When Mary Mallon was finally laid to rest in the Bronx, the city did not pause. There were no flowers sent, no memorial service, no loved ones in mourning. Her grave was a formality, simple, unadorned, and placed among other forgotten dead. But the silence surrounding her burial was not the end. In the years that followed, scholars, ethicists, and legal theorists began to pick apart her story with the precision of surgeons. What rights had she truly possessed? Could a person be punished for a danger they never intentionally wielded? Was Mary a murderer or a mirror held up to a society terrified of what it couldn't control? Some argued she was the victim of a moral panic, demonized for her class, her accent, her stubbornness. Others maintained that her defiance had consequences, that the lives lost because of her choices demanded accountability. But all agreed on one thing: her case marked a turning point. It was the beginning of the state's authority to isolate, surveil, and even incarcerate healthy individuals in the name of public health. And that authority has never been fully relinquished. Every pandemic since has echoed with her name. Her life became a precedent, and her body a case study. But what's most haunting is not what she did or didn't do. It's the unspoken question her story forces us to ask. What if you were the danger and didn't know it? What if the thing that made you a threat couldn't be seen, or touched, or believed? That is the fear that lingers, not Mary's typhoid, but her invisibility. As decades passed, the figure of Typhoid Mary began to shift from scientific curiosity to something more spectral. She became the archetype of the unknowing carrier, the smiling face behind the plague, the clean hands that poisoned without touch. Her story seeped into pop culture, appearing in novels, plays, films, and even superhero comics. But in these retellings, the woman was always distorted, either vilified as a stubborn harbinger of doom or romanticized as a martyr crushed by bureaucracy. The truth, complicated, contradictory, and deeply human, rarely made it through. No one remembered the girl who crossed the Atlantic alone, or the young woman who made her name in New York's elite kitchens, proud of her stews and sweet creams. That Mary was overwritten by the headlines, the court reports, the medical case files, and the label, Typhoid Mary, became a curse handed down to others. During the AIDS crisis, it was used to shame super spreaders. During COVID-19, it re-emerged again, slapped on asymptomatic travelers and non-compliant citizens. Each time, her legacy was dragged forward like a warning bell, but no one asked what it meant to live under that weight, to have your name used as shorthand for fear. Mary had once said, "I have never been sick a day in my life, and yet I am treated like a leper." That line, almost forgotten, says more than any medical chart ever could, because the real horror in her story isn't just the disease she carried, it's what we did to her because of it. There is something uniquely American about the way Mary Mallon was both elevated and erased. She was made famous without her consent, turned into a symbol she didn't understand, then cast aside to rot in isolation. The media built her myth brick by brick, each article adding to a prison of reputation. Headlines dubbed her the most dangerous woman in America, even as she lived alone in a shack, eating canned food and watching the skyline from afar. There was no trial, no defense, just relentless exposure. Her name was leaked, her face was published, her disease became her identity, and once that mask was fastened, there was no removing it. For the American public, she ceased to be Mary Mallon. She was only Typhoid Mary, never a person, always a pathogen. It was an easier story to tell, but buried within that narrative was something more insidious. The idea that some lives are expendable in service of the collective, that fear can justify exile, that poverty, ethnicity, and ignorance can be spun into blame. Mary was poor, Irish, unmarried, and defiant, traits that made her a perfect target. In that way, her downfall was not just a medical tragedy, but a social one. She was punished not merely for what she carried, but for what she represented. The porous boundary between the safe and the unsafe, the known and the invisible. That is why she haunts, not as a ghost with rattling chains, but as a name we still invoke when control slips through our fingers and we need someone to blame. Even now, Mary Mallon's story offers no easy resolution. If she had lived today, with access to education, support, and modern medicine, would her fate have been different? Would she have been offered antiviral treatment, counseling, a chance to work in safety rather than be caged? Or would she still have been scapegoated, her body turned into a battlefield between science and fear? In many ways, the question is rhetorical, because Mary lived at the crossroads of two incompatible truths. She was both innocent and responsible. She did not intend to harm, but she refused to believe the evidence. She was a victim of biology, but also of pride. That duality makes her more terrifying than any murderer because she forces us to look inward. Could we too be dangerous and not know it? Could our sense of righteousness blind us to the harm we cause? That's the true horror of Mary's legacy, not just that she carried death in her gut, but that she insisted, until her final breath, that she hadn't. The moment of reckoning never came. No confession, no regret, just silence. And in that silence we are left with a spectre, not a killer, not a martyr, but a reflection of ourselves, our biases, our fears, our desperate need to assign blame when faced with the chaos of disease. Typhoid Mary wasn't a monster, she was a mirror, and what we saw in her frightened us far more than what she ever did. When historians and public health scholars revisit the case of Mary Mallon, they often reduce it to timelines and bacterial cultures, to policy lessons and epidemiological milestones. But to do so is to strip it of its horror. The real dread doesn't lie in the presence of Salmonella typhi. It lies in what society chose to do in response. They isolated a woman indefinitely without legal process. They denied her dignity, demonized her name, and turned her into a cautionary tale long before they understood the science fully. They made her into an emblem of contagion rather than a patient. And that transformation, from woman to warning, is what gives her story its uniquely haunting shape. Mary's quarantine outlasted any active threat she posed. She was kept long after the public had moved on, like a relic of fear too dangerous to set free. She wasn't a chapter that could be closed, but a symbol that had to be maintained. And though no barbed wire surrounded her cottage, the weight of suspicion became its own kind of fence. It's easy to imagine her walking the moss-slick paths of North Brother Island with aching knees, watching ferries in the distance, knowing they would never stop for her. Her exile was more than physical, it was spiritual, a slow erasure of self. And in that erasure lies the true Gothic horror, that a society so eager to cleanse itself of disease would choose to cleanse itself of a person instead, and then forget the body that remained behind. By the late 20th century, the island that imprisoned Mary had fallen silent. North Brother Island, once a hub of medical containment, became a ruin, its buildings collapsing, its halls swallowed by vines and bird nests. The Riverside Hospital, where Mary lived out her years, decayed into Gothic wreckage. Her tiny cottage, weather-beaten and windowless, still stands, though barely. It remains untouched, like a mausoleum not just to one woman, but to a moment in American history where fear overruled empathy. Urban explorers who have ventured there speak of an eerie stillness, a sense that the island breathes with withheld stories. One rusted bed frame, a shattered glass vial, paper logs stained with moisture, still bearing names long buried, and always, in the back of their minds, the spectre of the cook who became a myth. There is no memorial for Mary Mallon on the island, no plaque, no marker, no apology, only absence. Her life, reduced to footnotes and metaphors, has become too uncomfortable to honor and too iconic to ignore. She exists in the liminal space between public health history and folklore, but her name, despite everything, endures. Not as Mary, the woman, but as Typhoid Mary, the warning, and that endurance is its own kind of punishment, to be remembered, not for your life, but for the fear you caused, to be immortal, not in love or achievement, but in blame. The tragedy of Mary Mallon lingers not because she was the first, or even the most dangerous, but because she became a fixed point in the moral imagination of a country. Her name outlived her deeds. Her story was taught to schoolchildren, cited in court cases, and repeated in policy debates, not to understand her, but to remind society what it feared most: contamination without warning. The betrayal of trust through invisible means. But buried beneath the science and stigma is the quiet despair of a life interrupted. Mary never married, never had children, never went home. She spent more years on North Brother Island than she ever spent in any one place in her entire life. Her exile was not only geographic, it was emotional. relational, existential. She became a person people avoided mentioning, like a sickness in the family, and in that forgetting, a second kind of death occurred, the kind where the body is gone, but the person was never seen to begin with. And yet, there's something achingly human in her resistance, her refusal to accept what she couldn't see, her defiance in the face of experts, her pride in the only skill she had. It doesn't excuse the outcome, but it does explain the person. Mary Mallon wasn't a monster. She was a cook, a daughter, an immigrant, a woman made into something she didn't understand, and in her confusion and outrage, she left behind a legacy far more haunting than any deliberate evil, the horror of being punished for what your body does when you're just trying to live. In the decades since Mary Mallon's death, medical science has expanded its ability to detect, prevent, and treat typhoid fever. We now understand asymptomatic carriers, have antibiotics to control the disease, and clear public protocols for managing outbreaks. And yet, the essential dilemma that Mary embodied remains unresolved. When does the safety of the many justify the destruction of the one? Mary was not the last person to be quarantined indefinitely. During the 20th and 21st centuries, others, some infected with tuberculosis, others with drug-resistant strains of disease, have faced similar fates, some voluntarily, some not. What Mary's story reveals is that even the most rational public health measures can become profoundly inhumane when carried out without compassion or consent. She had no advocate, no path to redemption, no formal charges. Just a cell without bars and a name turned into folklore. To the government, she was a necessity. To the public, she was a freak. To herself, she was innocent. That triangle of perception, authority, fear, denial, created a pressure cooker of injustice that slowly erased her personhood. And though she's long dead, her shadow still stretches across the debate any time a quarantine is ordered or a carrier is named. Her name is now a warning. But the warning isn't just about disease, it's about how easily a person can vanish beneath the weight of collective fear, never to be seen again, except as a cautionary tale whispered through history. If you were to stand at the shoreline of North Brother Island today, gazing across the water toward the ever-pulsing skyline of New York, it would feel like two worlds staring at one another, one living, one abandoned. The wind rustles through broken windows and tangled trees, but the loudest sound is absence. Somewhere, beneath the soil and rotted wood, lie the imprints of footsteps, long faded. Mary Mallon's among them. Her story is no longer taught as a tragedy, but as a curiosity, a line in textbooks about epidemiology or a footnote in legal debates on forced isolation. But to walk her path is to feel the weight of something greater, the chilling ease with which society sacrifices the individual when confronted with invisible fear. She wasn't tried, she wasn't heard, she was simply removed. And that is where the horror sharpens, not in the disease she carried, but in how quickly she ceased to be seen as human. In Mary's downfall, we find echoes of every time a government moved faster than its conscience, every time fear screamed louder than fairness. It's tempting to blame her, simpler that way, but history whispers back with a harder truth. She was never the sickness, she was its shadow. The proof that terror doesn't need monsters to thrive, just uncertainty and someone to point at. And once the pointing begins, the person behind the name fades, leaving only the name behind. So the name remains, Typhoid Mary, embedded in headlines, echoed in courtrooms, etched into the dark corners of our cultural memory. It resurfaces not with compassion, but with accusation, a symbol weaponized whenever fear outpaces understanding. But names have weight, and this one, this label wrapped around a woman's life, still crushes the truth beneath it. Mary Mallon was not a villain carved from evil. She was a product of her time, her poverty, her pride. She made terrible decisions, yes, but so did the institutions that trapped her, the newspapers that fed on her, and the public that refused to see a human beneath the illness. She died on an island alone, buried in a plain grave under a name that never fit, and that is where the real horror lives, not in what she spread, but in what we allowed to happen in the name of control. In the end, Mary Mallon became less a woman than a warning, but if you listen closely, closely to the silence of her cottage, to the still air above her grave, to the lessons still left unlearned, you may hear something softer beneath the fear, a whisper, not of sickness, but of sorrow, of a woman misused, misunderstood, and misremembered, not a monster, just a mirror, one that still reflects how quickly humanity is lost when we choose safety over justice and blame over truth.